Welcome to the student faculty seminar of the President's Lecture Series and to the Philosophy Forum. It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Professor Michael Schwartz. He is the distinguished teaching professor and professor emeritus of sociology at Stony Brook University, and he's also the founder and director of the College of Global Studies at Stony Brook. And he's a prominent voice of the left, a position that's badly in need of advocacy and in worse need of influence. So it's really a great privilege to have Professor Schwartz here. He will give a lecture this evening at 8 o'clock in the Dennison Theater, and his topic will be, "It's the oil, stupid." Oily aspects of the current wars in Iraq and Syria and in hotspots on 5 continents. His topic this afternoon is military neoliberalism, the evolving profile of U.S. foreign policy in the 21st century. Please join me in welcoming Professor Schwartz.
Is the speaker okay? I can't. Can everybody hear me? Fine?
You should speak as loudly as you can.
I should speak. Oh, okay. Let me put my declamatory voice on. I thank you for the cordial welcome, and I want to begin by talking about reading, actually, the beginning of a recent article in the New York Times about the Ebola crisis in Africa, and in particular, what is going on in Liberia, which is becoming one of the sort of key places, but also the key moments of coverage, at least for my hometown paper, the New York Times. This is the opening of an article that I think was on Wednesday, and I'm going to read it quite at length because I think it illustrates a lot of the pieces that I want to talk about today, about what I call neoliberalism, military neoliberalism. This is the article. For decades, Liberians have referred to the armed forces of Liberia as soldiers them. As in, soldiers them came and raped my daughter, or soldiers them beat my husband at the checkpoint in Painesville. Now soldiers them, once responsible for toppling the government, killing civilians, and setting the nation on a course toward a devastating civil war, have suddenly become the linchpin in the fight against Ebola virus rampaging through the country. Huddled with American military personnel in the capital, Monrovia, Liberian soldiers rehearsed their roles in the effort to build 18 Ebola treatment units across the country. Quote, at the Monrovia Medical Unit yesterday, over 100 citizens were out there watching the construction. Major General Darrell A. Williams, the commander of the U.S. Army Africa, noted pointedly. Nice to them, he instructed. Be nice to them, he instructed the group. A little while later in the article, that, getting the people to be nice to the Liberian Army, is no easy task. The room where the group was meeting is just a few yards from the beach where in 1980 drunken soldiers killed 13 top Liberian government officials after staging the coup, a chilling start to a military dictatorship under Samuel K. Doe. One of the new treatment centers being built to fight Ebola was just a few miles from a refugee camp where uniformed soldiers wielding machine guns and cutlasses slaughtered 400 men and women and 200 children in 1993. One of many atrocities committed during the Civil War that began after the rebels tried to oust Mr. Doe. A little later in the article, replacing such images in the public consciousness with ones of Liberian soldiers working side by side with American troops and making nice with ordinary Liberians is a tough sell, even if the enemy is now a terrifying crisis steamrolling through the country, killing more than 2,300 people in 6 months. The American military has had trainers in Liberia for years to help reinvent the country's army. Now, President Obama's decision to send American troops to build Ebola treatment units has added another layer to these already complex ties. On Thursday afternoon, 4 Marine V-22 Ospreys landed in Liberia's international airport in a thunder of noise. General Williams, the American commander here, was making plans to buzz Monrovia with the $70 million aircraft, counting on the visual and audio impact to tell Liberians that they were not alone in their Ebola fight. This is what I found when I read this. When I was planning this talk, I was going like this with the New York Times, because it captures so much of where we have progressed in terms of the way our foreign policy is conducted and the goals, ambitions, and tasks that we give to our military. Notice, which might be very surprising, that with this incredible medical crisis in countries where the medical systems are really, let's just call them understaffed to start with, right, that the U.S. has decided that its aid is going to take the form of military aid, of sending the military. And then what is the military going to do? Well, it's going to build houses, build treatment centers. Now, the treatment center idea doesn't sound like too bad an idea, but one would think that if you were going to be a full court press, you know, the country, as President Obama has said recently, is the go-to country for aid in every crisis, that you would send something a little more directed at the medical situation, with more medical personnel, and perhaps just sending people to be medical personnel to treat the disease, which is one of the most agonizing lacks in Liberia and several of the other countries. But instead, it was the military that was to be sent, and the military was given a goal that perhaps it can fulfill, which is to actually build treatment centers. So that's one kind of thing. The second kind of thing is that it's treated as a military campaign. I think this sentence from the article really captures it. The enemy now is a terrifying virus steamrolling through the country, killing more than 2,300 people in 6 months. That's a military image, and it's pretty clear that the military is looking upon it as a military campaign. And as a matter of fact, that's the third element of this that's really kind of wild, which is they've got this military in Liberia that is hated by everybody, feared by everybody, and you're going to use that military as the main vehicle for doing your work on the Ebola crisis. So the idea is to convert the Liberian military into the good old American military that can do these kinds of humanitarian activities, right? And I think that humanitarian activity is very important, because I think what we'll see here is that humanitarianism as a military goal has become deeply embedded in American policy. And you can hear it in this quote from General Carter F. Ham, who in 2012 was the head of the U.S. Africa Command. He no longer is. And in giving a speech at one of the military academies in the United States, I'm not sure where, he described the goal of the Africa Command, which is generally referred to as AFRICOM. You might have heard of it. It appears in the papers as AFRICOM. The main goal was to strengthen democratic institutions in Africa and boost broad-based economic growth, including through trade and investment. And in less than a sentence, I think he captured what is really, really, really new about the way the U.S. is using its military as a foreign policy device, where this phrase doesn't even include military action, but of course it's implied that military action might be needed to do these things, right? It's not as though they're denying a military role, but they're elevating the military role to a rather significant place in world politics, right? That the American military's job is to strengthen democratic institutions and boost broad-based economic growth. We might also take that to mean broad-based economic change, right, through trade and investment, right? So what do we have here? We have here that the military has become, I could say, a primary instrument of U.S. foreign policy, but I think if we look over the panorama of what's happened, let's say, since 1990, but more dramatically since the year 2000, the military is the primary instrument of U.S. foreign policy, something that I think a military-first policy, you might call it, because some event occurs in the world, the first thought is, what can the military do? And we see that very frequently. For example, when this big tsunami hit, who was sent? It was the Navy, right? Second, its role is as the point process for instituting significant political economic transformation in the host country. So they're not just going in to handle a crisis. They're not just going in to replace a vicious dictator. Their job is to strengthen democratic institutions, boost broad-based economic growth, really go in and become the point for transforming that country, right? And then the larger part, which is captured in the same little sentence where he says, including through trade and investment, is that what this policy, what this military prime policy will do is integrate this country into the globalized economy that the United States is kind of, what would you call it, the foremost advocate of, right? This globalized economy. And, you know, we've seen a lot of ways in which the U.S. presses for this globalized economy and the various trade agreements that it negotiates and attempts to negotiate. You know, some of the names we've heard are NAFTA, which was the 1996 agreement that opened up the trade among Mexico, the United States, and Canada, right? And a whole set of other things. And that is generally goes under the rubric of neoliberalism, and that's why I use the word neoliberalism to designate it, this idea that you're going to change the world in the direction of opening up trade, opening up countries for investment by foreign corporations, right? And by going through what's called structural adjustment, which generally means that the government's size and capacity to influence the local economy is drastically reduced or changed. Now, one of the things, and I've been studying this for quite some time, and part of what I try to understand is where did this military and neoliberalism policy come from? And the other part that I've been much more occupied with until recently is what are the consequences of a military neoliberalism policy. I'm going to try to go quickly through not so much the causes of it, but the origins of it, looking over time at you know, how this is developed and when it is developed, and then dwell on what I think is really the most scary part of it, and I'll call it scary because the consequences of marrying the military with economic political transformation, which is one way to describe this, right? And say we're going to use military means in order to transform the political and economic system of the host countries for our military. What kinds of really horrifying, to me, consequences occur? Going back, and let's be real, right? Though this policy applies everywhere, the Middle East has become a focal point for it, and not even that recently, certainly starting in the 90s. So one of the things I tried to do is go back and find the first time I really, you know, could find some reference by policymakers towards this kind of thinking in which you're going to use the military in this way. And the earliest one I can find, I'm sure maybe some people here who have been studying similar things can find some earlier sites, is from Henry Kissinger in 1975 when he was reflecting on the first oil crisis. And he was asked by Business Week on January 1st, 1975, if Washington would consider military action in response to another round of price increases by OPEC. You know, for those who maybe, you know, don't know about this, the way that this oil crisis in 1971 occurred was that a dramatic increase in the price of oil was organized by OPEC, which is the cartel of all the major oil exporting countries. And they said, we're just going to raise the price of oil and you guys are going to deal with it. And what happened in the United States, you know, it was felt everywhere, but in the United States, I still remember being on lines 3-4 hours long to get gasoline, being told that I couldn't buy gas on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, but I could buy gas on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. It was very inconvenient, but I don't think anybody really suffered tremendously, but other places did suffer. And here's what Kissinger replied. He said, "It is one thing to use in the case of a dispute over price, that is, a dispute that could be settled through negotiation, but it's another where there is some actual strangulation of the industrialized world," right? And so what he's saying here is, he says, if we really got to the point where they made it difficult for us to run our economies, which was definitely in those days, and still now, really possible that if OPEC decided, well, we're not going to give you any oil, you could really bring a crisis about that would be, the economy would just slow down and stop. And that's what he's referring to. And I don't think that his sense that that might happen was too far off, though maybe it wouldn't have happened in that context. We don't know, right? And he said, then we would have to consider military action. Now, that's the first time that anybody ever said that we might consider military action in the Middle East. Now, not that we hadn't engaged in military action in the Middle East, but it was more covert. For example, the coup d'etat in Iran in 1954, which ousted their Mossadegh, their democratically elected president, was a military action, but it wasn't our military that did it. We only sponsored it. So then we move forward to be bipartisan of this. And the next moment is in 1979, and this is before the Iranian Revolution, which took place a few months after this. But what was going on was the old war in Afghanistan, when the Russians were fighting the Taliban, what became the Taliban in Afghanistan. And Carter was remarking on the fact that if Russia were successful, at that time it was the Soviet Union, if the Soviet Union was successful, that would bring them very close to the oil fields in the Middle East and give them a chokehold over a possible, probable, wished-for route from the Caspian Sea oil down to that area that the United States was sponsoring. And he said in his in an earlier speech that he then reiterated in his State of the Nation address the following January, let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf regions, that's where all the oil is, right, will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America. And such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. This is the first time that any high American official actually threatened the use of military force in the Middle East. And he followed that up 3 months later by establishing what he called the Rapid Deployment Force, which was 2 brigades of American troops who were going to be stationed in various strategic locations with a facility to be airlifted into the Middle East for a military intervention if it was needed. So that's sort of the start of this idea. We're going to use the military for what you might call economic intervention, right? There are many intervening moments where different pieces were put into place, and including the Gulf War, when Bush I was finally fought a war in the Middle East. That was the first time that we actually fought a war in the Middle East. And everything sort of proceeds forward into the Bush II administration, where the idea, the goal of the war in Iraq especially, but even the war in Afghanistan was stated in muted terms, really became this kind of goal. And instead of reading some of the early statements about what the goals in Iraq were, I read from a National Security Strategy document of 2006, which is a document that's issued every 4 years by the American government, by the high military officials, with the president. This is going to be the strategy for the next 4 years. What are our major goals in the next 4 years, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It usually does not get published and publicized. Usually what happens is there are leaks, and various journalists get to see it, and they write stories about it, and we know what's in it. But in 2006, for some reason that I still have not heard a convincing argument about, it was just released. And so we can actually read it ourselves. And I want to read the sort of the bullet points at the start, that this is the goals for our American military starting in 2006. We know from journalistic coverage that the 2002 National Security Strategy document is very similar, and we know that the 2010 is similar. The 2014 I haven't read about yet. I don't think it's been issued, but it probably will be soon, or we will get coverage of it. And this is these are the bullet points. This is the goals for the U.S. military in the next 4 years. Champion aspirations for human dignity. Strengthen alliances to defeat global terrorism and to work to prevent attacks against us and our friends. That's one that we would all have expected. If I conducted a quiz, everybody would have put that one in, right? Because 2006, terrorism was the story, right? Work with others to diffuse regional conflicts, another fairly intuitive one. Prevent our enemies from threatening us, our allies, and our friends with weapons of mass destruction, another one that was highly topical at that time, even though we had already pretty well definitively proven that the Iraqis did not have any weapons of mass destruction, but it was still part of the rhetoric. Ignite a new era of global economic growth through free markets and free trade. Now that's a little bit strange for a military strategy, right? But once you know that that's where they were headed, it's not surprising to see that they got there, right? Expand the circle of development by opening societies and building the infrastructure of democracy. Another one that is pretty interesting to say that we're going to do this with the military, right? But it's also something that's very familiar. The phrase of opening societies, right? That's a pretty straightforward phrase in our language, our political language these days. That means there are some societies that are not open to the globalization process that involves international capitalism and large corporations. We want to open those closed countries, open them up to the kind of development that these dynamic European, American, Japanese economies have to offer by allowing the big companies to get in there and really do their job of developing those countries, bringing them modernization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Neo-Liberalism. Expand the circle of development by opening societies and building the infrastructure of democracy. Develop agendas for cooperative action with other main centers of global power. So we're going to do this with other countries, other major countries. Transform America's national security institutions to meet the challenges and opportunities of the 24th century. That is saying we have to make sure that our military is capable of doing these things, right? Instead of being a traditional military, it has to be a sort of all-arounder now. Engage the opportunities and confront the challenges of globalization. A kind of reiteration of what they'd already said, but putting globalization explicitly into the equation, right? So this is the 2006 policy, and it's a policy that has remained pretty well fixed, at least since 2002 and up till now, right? I want to mention just a couple of things that are important to reiterate here. One of them is that in this is the valorization of what has become known as humanitarian intervention. The notion of humanitarian intervention has been growing in world politics since 1945, but really since the 1990s when the phrase was really coined, and maybe in reaction to Rwanda, where there was a UN military force in Rwanda when the genocide in Rwanda took place, and they watched, because their mandate was not to engage in military action. Their mandate was to stand between contending sides and make sure that the two sides don't get at each other. And it was always based on the idea that the two sides, having agreed to this group to be there, that they wouldn't breach that pattern. But of course, one side decided to breach the pattern in Rwanda, and they killed 800,000 people while the UN watched. In response to that, a lot of people started saying, no, we have to send troops in who are ready to fight, to force peace, right? Rather than to be peacekeepers, to force peace, right? Peacemaking is the phrase that got done. And then finally, in 2002, an official UN document didn't coin the term, but institutionalized the term of the responsibility to protect, R2P, which means that the community of nations have the responsibility, military and otherwise, to protect people from humanitarian crisis, even if it's caused by their own country, even by their own government. So this, you hear that echoed in this NSS, and you hear that echoed in the statements that are made, right? And then the other part of that is that by the folding together of democracy and economic development, of opening societies and stopping dictatorships, you see the marriage of humanitarianism with economic transformation. That the only way we're going to successfully complete our humanitarian task of protecting people from terrible governments is by transforming the country politically and economically so that the humanitarian crisis will not just be stopped, but will forever be eliminated, because the positive growth dynamic, that the bringing in of trade and so on and so forth will allow the people to prosper and not suffer. Okay, so that's kind of the portrait of how this set of ideas works. And if you listen to, in the last dozen years or so, American presidents, they always invoke different versions of these themes. And, you can go on quoting them forever. But I want to say, so there's been a scholarship developed around this, about humanitarian intervention in particular. And one of the major figures in it is a woman named Martha Fenimore, who summed it all up this way. Intervention is not simply This humanitarian intervention is not simply with the aim of stopping killing, but instead has the mission of reconstructing entire states and societies in ways that did not occur in previous periods of history. Interventions are no longer simply military affairs in which killers are disarmed and, if necessary, replaced in government by a new set of rulers. The interventions now involve a wide range of non-military components involving reconstruction and social services mostly provided by international organizations aimed at overhauling war-torn society and remaking them in accordance with the normative, preferred, liberal democratic model. So that's, I mean, if you read the rest of what Fenimore is talking about, there's a lot of irony in her statement, because, in the next and following paragraph she says, oh yeah, that's really what happens, But I think she's captured pretty well in that statement exactly what the kind of, shall we call it, the public ambition of military ambitions are, because we know, and not to restrict myself to the United States as a great power, when great powers intervene, they don't intervene for one simple reason or even for one coherent set of reasons like that. There's a multiple of motives and a multiple of forces being pushing and shoving, and military intervention doesn't necessarily look like that pretty picture or that ironically pretty picture. And even the motives are not as pretty as that. But what does it look like when that actually happens? Well, we have two pretty thoroughgoing examples of it, and many, many partial examples of it in the last dozen years of history. And the two thoroughgoing examples of it, of course, are Afghanistan and Iraq. So they constitute pretty good case studies for understanding what goes on. And what I want to argue is that they're basically what these kinds of, this marriage, let's call it a marriage, right, between economic transformation, political economic transformation, and kinetic military action, violent military action, right? This marriage of this yields two cycles. One cycle is the simple one. You get military intervention, military violence, you trigger a humanitarian crisis, large numbers of problems, and then that humanitarian crisis leads to yet another military intervention. And then within that larger cycle, what I think is the inner cycle of that is you've got the military and violence, and then what's supposed to happen at the end of that military violence, or during it, or when areas are found to be conquered or pacified, right, is they're supposed to be rebuilt, reconstructed, right? And that has this vision of good things happening, right? But in the case of economic transformation, political economic transformation, you're not going to reconstruct. You're going to construct something new. So instead of reconstructing whatever damage was done, you are now going to construct something brand new in its place. And therein is the danger. And what happens instead of reconstruction is you get a further immiseration. So the initial violence, of course, creates immiseration. It creates misery for the people who are the hosts for that violence, right? Wars are very destructive, and no matter how much they talk about precision weapons, those wars are still very destructive. And the people who are living in those war zones are suffering tremendous damage to their lives and their families. Not just death, but the infrastructure is gone, their homes are gone, maybe their livelihood is destroyed, and the reconstruction process that's expected is not going to reconstruct their livelihoods. It's going to reconstruct them into a new, better system, right? But what happens instead is that effort at reconstruction only makes things worse for those people. So you get a second immiseration. And it's that second immiseration that produces reactive protest of all sorts. Reactive actions of all sorts, including things like people leaving en masse and going somewhere else, and having being put in refugee camps in neighboring countries or in neighboring regions of their own country, right, where they become even more miserable, right? But they also produce violent reaction, and they produce wars. Responsive wars to the initial violence. Not just to the initial violence, because usually at the end of the initial violence, the people are defeated, you know. They're, oh, we don't want to fight you guys. You're really good, you know. You can beat us. But after further immiseration, at least some people, and in some places, say our only choice is to fight. And so they fight to restore their original system. And then, of course, what happens is that there's another war, because they have to come and be reconquered again. So that's what this combination of military intervention and economic transformation generates. And I want to quickly now go through just a couple of examples, one small, one large, one from Afghanistan, one from Iraq, to show you how I think it works, okay? To begin with, here's what General Petraeus said when he took command of CENTCOM, which is in charge of the Middle East. AFRICOM is in charge of Africa. CENTCOM is in charge of the Middle East. He became the commander of CENTCOM, and he announced, he went before Congress, and he gave a very long testimony about what he was going to do in all the different countries that CENTCOM had to deal with. And this is what he said about Afghanistan. He said, another major component of our strategy is to disrupt narcotics trafficking, which has provided significant funding for the Taliban insurgency. This drug money has been the oxygen in the air that allows these groups to operate. With the recent extension of authority granted to U.S. forces to conduct counter-narcotics operations, we are better able to work with the Afghan government more closely to eradicate illicit drugs, shut down drug labs, and disrupt trafficking networks. And here's the payoff. To complement these efforts, we will also promote viable, agricultural alternatives, build Afghan law enforcement capacity, and develop the infrastructure to help Afghan farmers get their products to market. So in this, you see, you get the capture of the whole picture, right? Now, narcotics, right, the opium cultivation is the way in which these villagers are, in fact, supporting themselves in many of the areas, but not by any means all of them, right? And so he's saying, we got to get rid of that, for sure, and we'll give them new kinds of agriculture, and we won't only give them new kinds of agriculture, we're going to set it up so that they can actually market their products instead of having subsistence agriculture and having to go on the black market with the opium products, right? And Bush summarized this as reforms needed to transition from a command and control economy to a modern market-based system. That's Bush's meta-demands. So what happens? Okay, Kandahar, which was a Taliban stronghold. Now we're fast forwarding. We're out of the Bush administration. We're in the Obama administration. Obama gets elected. He's going to reproduce the so-called, I call it so-called success of the surge in Iraq with a surge in Afghanistan. And this is Petraeus's big plan, right? And so they go into all the various strongholds and they do what Petraeus is saying. They're going to wipe out the local agriculture and replace it. And before they do that, they have to get the Taliban. Right? So here's an example. This is a village called Taroka Kalacha. This is New York Times coverage. It was so heavily mined by the Taliban. They had those mines that you can't really find. They're very hard to find, right? So if the American soldiers chose to march in, they would undoubtedly detonate many of these mines and hurt themselves, maybe kill themselves. So what they did was the American forces resorted to aerial bombardment and leveled the whole village, 36 homes, right? So that's kind of a typical thing that happened there, right? The real problem is that, okay, now they're supposed to build, right? But the amount of money, when they looked at Kandahar province, it was $100 million to rebuild the villages. $4 million were allocated to it. Now you say, well, how can they do that, right? I mean, that doesn't sound right. Right? But remember, they don't really want to rebuild the village. What they want to do is build something new. And they think, and this is part of the official thing, is that you're going to open this place up and then there's going to be investment from outside. So it can be rebuilt by agricultural entrepreneurs who are going to do market-type agriculture, right? So here's another village. This is the village of Panjwai, right? They actually were not a narcotics village. They were a wine production village. And the wine production was destroyed by fighting, right? Now, instead of reproducing the wine, which also was not a very good market crop, right? It wasn't going to make it on the international market. Afghan wines are just not going to compete with French wines. So what they did was they built a road into the village that wiped out a lot of the irrigation system that had been there before, right? And then what they did was they said, okay, now you have the ability to transport your troops, right, your crops right to market because this road goes straight to the main town, right? And you know, you're going to be able to market your crops. And if you want to grow wine and try to get to the market with it, great, go ahead and do that. Now here's the New York Times coverage of what happens. So the highway is being built. The local anger found various forms of expression. Tribal and religious leaders petitioned the government the government officials. By the way, you can't trust these local people to be the government officials. Remember, this is a Taliban area, right? And they all supported the Taliban. So what you do is you bring in a new government. This is part of that democratic transformation, right? You have to bring in a good government, right? So they brought in a government of people that didn't know anything about the place and didn't know what they were doing. And besides, they were all afraid of the local villages because they thought the local villages might kill them, right? Tribal and religious leaders from the local village petitioned the government and box officials and the NATO officers who were there, the U.S. NATO officers, to alter the route or cancel the highway altogether. Affected residents mounted various public protests, including the much applauded act of civil disobedience by Bor Muhammad, who lay down in front of bulldozers in an effort to save his farm. When this failed, he was given a $6,000 compensation, far too little to restore his family's finances, and Muhammad vowed to ultimately, quote, wrest his land back. Abdul Nafi, a farmer who lost 2 acres of vines and almond trees to the road, spoke for many of his community when he told the New York Times, "The people are angry. The foreigners should not upset the people, otherwise they would go and join the Taliban." Perhaps he and Boer Mohammed were among the group of residents who contacted the Taliban, which promised, quote, to blow up the road and return the land to them as soon as the military situation made it possible. You see the pattern there. You see the beauty of it, right? Now the Taliban is out. You know, the people didn't love the Taliban. You know, the Taliban is a pretty vicious regime to live under, right? But the Taliban are out. They've run away. The village is destroyed. The U.S. is destroying it more, right? But one of the things that's inevitable is that these kinds of military operations, the U.S. military is going to leave to go on to the next village it's going to pacify, right? And when it leaves, the Taliban's going to come back in, and they probably will destroy the road, right? And they probably will restore the land, because they're not dumb. They know what gets support. Right? And then, of course, the United States is going to have to come back in and conquer it again, which is what they did, actually. Kandahar, they were in 3 times. Right? Now, so the news is that this whole process of destruction, followed by new immiseration, followed by rebellion, and then you get a remilitary intervention. So, Iraq. Very quickly in Iraq. When the United States invaded Iraq, the first thing that happened is that they defeated Saddam Hussein's army. This is the famous, you know, George Bush has been ridiculed for this speech. He said, you know, major military operations are over. He flew into an aircraft carrier to announce this. There was a way in which it was absolutely true. He had defeated Saddam Hussein's army, the government was destroyed, the U.S. was in control, physically in control of the whole country, with its allies, the willing. Not inaccurate at all, right? What he didn't realize was he was about to engage in another much bigger war, right? But, you know, this was the branch point. This is the branch point at that moment, because when the U.S. went in, toppled the government, assumed command of the country. Remember, for a year, the U.S. was running the country. It was only after a year that the U.S. appointed an Iraqi government to run the country, right? They instituted neoliberal reform with the military there to enforce it. And I'll give you just a taste of what it looked like. This was one of those command and control economies that President Bush hated, right? It was, socialists would never call it socialist, but Saddam Hussein would call it socialist because the government owned about 35% of the economy. And it didn't just own any 35% of the economy, it owned the core of the economy, right? The core industries, right? So the U.S. went in, and 1 month after assuming power, shut down 290 state-owned enterprises, which constituted the core of the economy, immediately plunging the country into a depression of the first order. Many places experienced 65% unemployment. Now, in tandem with this, they also got rid of the army because they hated that army anyway, right? So all the soldiers went home. And they also fired all of the political loyalists to Saddam Hussein, that is, to people who were members of the Ba'athist Party, so that the entire infrastructure of the government was annihilated. So they annihilated the government, they annihilated the army, and they annihilated the economy. So that's a good start if what you're going for this kind of transformation. Now what was supposed to happen is things were supposed to build up. Didn't happen. The rush of investment didn't occur. The U.S. allocated $20 billion for reconstruction from the war damage, when the estimates were that $100 billion were needed. People suffered Families suffered, everybody suffered, one week after another. People were demanding protests everywhere. How do you handle the protest? Well, you've got a big army there, right? And the army is in charge. The army was in charge of reconstructing Iraq, right? The State Department had formed a plan. Powell's State Department had a 2,000-page plan for reconstructing Iraq. They threw that out. They said, Rumsfeld gets the job, the army gets the job, and the army said, well, we know how to handle protests. We know how to handle this stuff. We smash them. So they started shooting at all the protesters, and pretty soon the protesters started shooting back. So this is, on the largest scale, the same pattern, right? You get the destruction of the war, you go into the rebuilding process, and instead of the rebuilding process producing rebuilding, it produces more problems. More and more and more problems. People get more and more and more desperate. And then in this case, what you got was a 7-year guerrilla war, right, all around the country, right, and with repeated U.S. military efforts to change it. So, you know, I could go on forever. I've got all these great examples of all the terrible things that happened, but I'll leave it here with these words, right? Going back to the original point, if what you do is you engage in military operations in some other country, we're not talking about defensive military operations, we're talking about interventions, your expeditionary forces, invasions, whatever you want to call it, and you marry that to an economic political transformation, it seems almost inevitable that what you are going to do is to, in the first instance, guarantee an increasingly deep immiseration of the people, and then a set of responses that the people will give, only some of them violence, right? I mean, the bulk of the reaction in Iraq, you know, even with this incredible war that was fought, right, 4 million people left. 4 million. They fled. Right? Because their situation at home was unviable. And it wasn't getting better. And then when you get that kind of displacement, when you get that kind of misery, you inevitably generate a new round of protest. And when you generate that new round of protest and you don't answer the demands, and you repress that protest, you will get a new round of violence. So we have entered an era where we have many countries, not just Iraq and Afghanistan, that are in the midst of this. And we don't know when it's going to end, because we don't know when the marriage of military intervention and economic transformation is going to end. Or, to put it maybe a little more simply, when I think the last number I saw was 1,080 American bases around the world are shrunken back to Fortress America. Thank you. So I took a little longer than I should. Yeah.
I'm hoping you can say a few words about how this military neoliberalism relates not only to domestic neoliberalism, but to some related political movements, neoconservatism, centrism, communitarianism.
Oh, well, they all, the neoconservatism is did everybody hear the question? You hear the question back there? Okay, so taking the small one first, neoconservatism, which we don't hear a lot about now, but from 1995 to about 2005, neoconservatism was on everybody's lips that was concerned about these things because Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz, and 6 or 7 other of the major policymakers, especially the military policymakers, but also the policymakers in general in the Bush administration, were associated themselves with the label neoconservative. And the neoconservatives were the authors of this, of the aggressive part of American military policy. advocated during the Clinton administration, they advocated a very powerful, it's worth going a little bit into it because for them it all started with the fall of the Soviet Union. Because when the fall of the Soviet Union took place, what they perceived this as is that we're the last one standing now. There's only one superpower left. And they developed the concept of the unipolar world. That is to say, we now have a world instead of two poles or multiple poles, we have one dominant force in the world. And that dominant force in the world, the United States, ought to become the arbitrator of all things in the world. We should be the country in the world that goes around, to put a positive cast on it, imposing the peace, a Pax Americana. In fact, they even used the phrase Pax Americana more than once. And that since the American economy then and now was not sufficient to dominate the world through economics, the one really powerful thing that the United States had was the military. Now, let's be clear about this. The U.S. military is a pretty extraordinary military at this moment in history. Give or take a few $billion, the U.S. spends as much money on its military as the rest of the world combined. If you look at the statistics over time, the range is between 47 and 53% of the world's military expenditures are spent by the United States, right? The next highest is China, and they're about 17% of the U.S. amount, right? So we are a dominant military power. We've got this military regime that can just take anything down. But let's keep in mind that what Iraq showed was that there's a certain limitation to this kind of military power. You can't beat a guerrilla war. That's one of the problems with it. But anyway, so the neoconservatives were saying, look, we have all these problems in the world. We have all these bad guys in the world. We've got, when they were talking, right, they said, okay, Saddam Hussein, he's a bad guy, right? Iran, they're a bad guy. Syria, they're a bad guy. But they even said Saudi Arabia is a bad guy, right? All the oil companies, all the oil countries are bad guys, right? It's interesting that, Saudi Arabia has always gotten a break with the U.S. press and the U.S. government, right? Because of all the vicious regimes going on, Saudi Arabia is certainly competitive as the worst, It's not advertised, right? But, when they were doing all the, when ISIS, raised itself to the level of the worst in the world, right, by beheading is it 2 or 3? 3 American journalists or 2 American journalists and 1 other, right? And then they were killed 187 people over here and, a few hundred people over there. In the last year, Saudi Arabia beheaded something like 50 people, They probably had more beheadings than the rest of the world combined that year, But they get a free break. But not for the neoconservatives. They saw Saudi Arabia as a problem. And they said we should use our military to change the world. Change the world. And that's exactly what they got into power with Bush. Rumsfeld and Cheney, were really running the Bush foreign policy, that's for sure. And the war was inevitable at that point, even before 9/11. The war in Iraq, anyway. The war in Afghanistan probably was a result of 9/11. So they, for that moment, what you might call hegemonic in the Bush administration. They sort of were the leaders among equals of the other policymakers. Of course, their policy was, kind of didn't work too well, and they were pretty well embarrassed. Rumsfeld, has been the target of just so many political and humorous attacks, right? He's almost a joke at this point. And Cheney also, and Wolfowitz has just sort of disappeared. He went to the World Bank, and then he got in trouble for sexual escapade and was removed from the World Bank after there was protests about him being at the head of the World Bank. So the high-level neoconservatives sort of disappeared from visibility, but the set of ideas that they promulgated, right, and they were advocates of all the rest of this military neoliberalism idea, have continued without, they're not needed anymore, right? They've accomplished their task, which is use the U.S. military, right, to impose various kinds of foreign policy initiatives around the world. And that is what is going on. So that's that. Internal neoliberalism was really the second part. I'm going to leave aside all the other ones. Internal neoliberalism, I think that we have to be really cautious about the word neoliberalism, and maybe it's just ill-fated for me to use it at all, because it was really coined back in the 1970s. And it was a term used by the people who advocated these kinds of policies. And what's happened is that it's been applied everywhere that I can think of, or attempted to apply everywhere. This idea that what you're going to do is open up the borders to trade. You're going to reduce trade barriers so that world trade can proceed. You're going to open up your country to foreign investment, right? And you are going to privatize economic functions out of the government into private hands, thereby, quote, making them more efficient, right? Those three elements are sort of the cornerstones. And what happens is that you go around the world and you see very different things take place. Right now, you see I've left out of this the one overarching thing that neoliberals have always been identified with, which is, what I want to do is I want to shrink the government down to the size of a pea and then drain it down the drain, right? You know, you hear that phrase a lot from a lot of, especially American politicians, but British politicians have also used that phrase a lot. Well, under neoliberal regimes, the American government has continued to grow. The only difference, in fact, most of the governments have continued to grow. The only difference between the growth that the neoliberals sponsor and the growth that, let's say, pre-neoliberal sponsored is that pretty much all the growth has been in social control. The growth has been in the military, the police, and various other kinds of social control. And the reductions have come in social welfare and other kinds of social programs. And even in, you know, ridiculous things like infrastructural programs that were not military related, right? So there has been a shrinking of government, but it hasn't been a shrinking of all of government. In fact, governments have grown, right? And of course, this applies differently in different places. And you go to Argentina, the government did shrink altogether because military wasn't a big part of it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So neoliberalism has been applied very differently in different places. And so it's hard to take this foreign policy piece and then say, okay, what's the analog in other places? And the foreign policy piece is not just in the U.S., but right, the U.S. as the leader of the, quote, free world, or whatever we are the leader of now, or the unipolar leader of the world, right, have influenced Britain, France, Germany, Japan is rearming, right, that this idea that your military is your leading force in international affairs has really taken over. And of course, in response, the Chinese are responding, the Russians haven't responded yet, but give them a chance, they will, and they're very military anyway, so you don't have to worry too much about them copying the pattern. So that part, I think you see in the big powers. Everybody who wants to be a big power is building their military. Israel is another one that's built its military. They have the fourth largest military now. This tiny little country has the fourth largest military, and they get billions and billions and billions of dollars from the United States, so they have all the modern weaponry. So they're set to go with this policy. So I think that we have to sort of look at neoliberalism through a different prism in each area of the world, in each country of the world. Yeah?
What part does defense contractors have to do with that?
That's a really good question. The question is, what part do defense contractors have in promulgating this policy? They're very big in D.C., and one of the things that me and Kevin Young, a colleague of mine, are trying to understand is exactly how much leverage the defense contractors have in determining defense spending. But I guarantee you it's a lot, and one way that you can really see that is that when there's been this pressure for reducing defense spending, by the way, the definition in the United States, maybe in other countries, but it's a very peculiar definition. The definition of reductions in defense spending is not that the actual number of dollars spent goes down. The definition of reduction in defense spending is that the rate of increase in defense spending goes down. Right? That's the definition of, but of course, that rate of increase, is pre-programmed, right? Because you've planned all these things. We're planning all these things, right? And then somebody says, no, you can't increase at 7% per year. You're going to have to increase at 6% per year. So then they're all running around saying, well, what are we cutting? Right? And one of the signs of the power of the defense contractors is that the weapons systems never get cut. Right? That's where the defense contractors are making their billions, right? Is in the weapons systems. They don't get cut. Things like the number of soldiers get cut. More and more and more soldiers are being cut. We don't need soldiers. We just need the technology, right? The drone warfare is a boon to that, right? He's got 5 guys sitting in a room in Nevada bombing Afghanistan and Pakistan. So yeah, they're having an influence on what's going on. It's hard to work out whether that also results in let's say, much more willingness to actually engage in battle, right? Because, we've spent a lot of money on defense without ever engaging in battle, so they might not be pushing for actual wars. Not sure on that part. Up there.
The independent contractors, the Blackwaters that we seem to hire to supplement our military. Well,
yeah, that's another very interesting thing. The independent contractors, every year they constitute a larger and larger part of the budget. Okay, so we know this is going on, right? They give great cover for the idea of we're reducing our presence somewhere. So when they were reducing the U.S. presence in Iraq, and President Obama was working very hard to get Iraq to agree to keep at least 10,000 American troops there, right, for a number of reasons that we don't have to go into, and Maliki wouldn't allow it. Their alternate plan was, okay, we won't. The State Department will be in charge. We won't have very many troops. We'll just have the troops that are at the State Department facilities. And then we'll just hire Blackwater and the gang to do the military parts that we need, right? And that was their plan. Well, it turned out not to work out because Maliki didn't want Blackwater there either, because Blackwater really, was hated by all the Iraqi people. So, so there is this trend to hire military contractors to do what used to be military activities. Things as simple as the food, right? It used to be, the picture of the World War II soldier is sitting there peeling potatoes. American soldiers don't peel potatoes anymore. They hire somebody to peel the potatoes for them. In fact, they hire somebody to bring them the meals. And that somebody is usually an American corporation that is making a huge amount of money off of this concession. Right? So going back to the neoliberalism question, right? You could call this another part of neoliberalism. The idea of neoliberalism, you're supposed to privatize functions from the economy. Well, the idea of privatizing the electrical system, which, I think is a really bad idea, but we already did that, right? The electrical system then sells directly to the consumer and makes a profit off of, you were buying your electricity, or if you're a company, you buy it from a private system. When you privatize military functions, you're not really privatizing it. What you're doing is you're hiring somebody to do a government function. And the government, ordinary citizens don't hire these security companies to fight a war for them. The government does. So it's just taking government revenues, tax revenues, just like before. You need all those tax revenues, gobble up those tax revenues, right? And then hand them over to a private company that can take a profit on doing the same thing that you could have, exploited soldiers to do, right? And of course, the soldiers in the private companies make a lot more money than the soldiers in the army, which might be a good thing, you know, because the soldiers are paid starvation wages in effect, right? But it's a lot more expensive to do it that way. So that is a trend that's going on, and maybe you could call it another aspect of neoliberalism. I'm not sure what the impact of having these private companies is on the overarching policies, right? The policies might be the same either way. It's hard to discern whether they are actually now creating a sort of policy vector that pushes the United States to more interventions, or to, you know, in Somalia to hire some military contractors to go do some work for them, that military violence that might not otherwise have been engaged in. It's hard to discern that, but I think it's something worth thinking about. Yeah.
Two-part question, please. How does this American foreign policy affect the United Nations and its role? And the other part is, can one refer to this as American fundamentalism?
Okay, so the UN is a tricky organization. It used to be, when there was the Cold War and there was the US and the Soviet Union, the UN had this kind of mediating role to play between the two big powers. It didn't do a great job of it, but it kind of had a set role in the world, that was its job, you know, and to mute the friction between them, and also to try to get between them if something hot started. And the UN just tried to play that role, and the various leaderships of the UN did that, right? Tried to play that role. Once the Soviet Union fell, the UN looked to, let's say, the Clinton administration, like another part of the unipolar world, with the US being able to use the UN as an ally, let's call it. I was going to say instrument of, but maybe we should call it an ally of this American unipolar policy of the US being the peacekeeper of the world with a Pax Americana. It didn't work out. They couldn't mobilize the UN in that way, right? So the Bush administration said, well, let's just forget about the UN. You know, once they couldn't get the UN to support the invasion of Iraq, they said, let's just forget about the UN. But it didn't work out very well, and the whole invasion of Iraq didn't work out very well. So I think that the situation right now in the United States is that the Obama administration is just plain confused about what it thinks it wants the UN to do, or what it thinks it can get the UN to do. And I think the leadership of the UN, or insofar as there is any, right, because the leadership has been, you know, made so second tier in the world that they don't even get they don't even get covered in the press unless they, you know, get some sponsorship from somebody, that they don't know what to try to do even. So the UN is kind of just drifting along, I think, and I think we have to wait and see whether it finds a role for itself. You know, there's been numerous efforts that I think are fairly promising for the smaller countries of the world to try to get the UN to be an instrument for expressing their needs. And they've had, you know, some beginnings of success, like the low-lying countries of the world have been really pressuring the UN to take the lead in the climate change question, because some of these countries are going to be underwater. You know, some of these island countries, right? And the UN has tried to do that with this series of the Copenhagen and other conferences on climate change, but unfortunately the US and its allies have pretty much sabotaged each one of them. But they keep trying, and there have been moments when you thought something good might come of them. So so I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen with the UN. Now the second part was, is this American fundamentalism? I don't think so. I think you can refer to it as American imperialism if you want. I don't think that the fundamentalist rhetoric that some of our leaders adopt, right? I mean, you know, Bush was a great source for this. You know, he actually called it a crusade, right? And you know, a lot of these guys characterized it as, you know, the clash of the civilizations and the, you know, Americans as, you know, the unique. Obama does some of that, you know. He says, here's one. And when a typhoon hits the Philippines, or schoolgirls are kidnapped in Nigeria, or masked men occupy a building in Ukraine, it is America that the world looks to for help. So America is and remains the one indispensable nation. Right? I mean, there's a kind of American fundamentalism captured in that, though he doesn't use the religious imagery, right? It's the same thing. But I think that there's an element of desperation in all this that I think is probably more important. The U.S., since 1990, has been attempting to establish itself as the kind of sole world leader. And it's been failing with incredible regularity. And that political ambition, which flowed out of the fall of the Soviet Union, right? And Tom Engelhardt, who's, you know, my part-time editor, colleague, and friend, right, who writes, has this this website called Tom Dispatch, right, has made this point over and over again that I think is really worth saying. The Cold War was lost by both sides. It's obvious that the Soviet Union lost the Cold War, they fell apart, right? But the US wrecked itself, its economy, and its polity in the Cold War. And just sort of staggered to the finish line, and then could look back and say, well, we won, now we're on top. But the US doesn't have the vitality, internal or external, to actually establish itself as a world leader. And what has been going on since then under Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, and Obama have been strategy after strategy to reestablish or to establish what they thought were the fruits of victory, which is to be the unipolar leadership of the world. It can't be done, right? The only trouble is that you can destroy the world trying to do it. That's the real problem. And this efflorescence of military is really something. And I would add one thing to that, just as a final thought, which is that, I mean, if we look around the panorama of the world, the amount of violence going on, military violence, is exquisite. You know, and I've seen some statistics, and I'm not sure I even believe them, that the number of people who have died in the last 20 years is greater than World War II, is greater than this, is greater than that. It might all be true, but I mean, you don't need those statistics to say, gee, they're fighting everywhere, right? There's one thing I want to say about this that I think is really worth pondering, which is that one reason why there is so much fighting, and the reason why this fighting produces so much death and destruction, is because the weaponry that the United States has developed and other countries have then copied is so incredibly destructive. And that you see something that's a small-scale level of violence magnify itself into huge levels of violence because this weaponry is brought to bear. And so when you hear the United States say, oh, we're going to go into Syria, right? We're going to start helping the Syrian rebels against this hard Assad regime, or we're going to help the Iraqi government against this horrible ISIS, right? You don't know what's going to happen when they say that. But I'll tell you one thing you know for sure, is that the rate of death and the rate of destruction of infrastructure is going to go up tremendously. When they say, we're going to arm the rebels, the rate of destruction is going to go up tremendously. Right? When they say, we're going to give aid to so-and-so, the rate of destruction is going to go up tremendously. That the one inevitable consequence of these, of military action and aid is to make sure that a lot more destruction, a lot more people are killed, a lot more lives are destroyed, and a lot more of whatever infrastructure a region or locality has will be more devastated. And the immiseration levels will therefore be 1 quantum or 2 quantums or 3 quantums further along. Is that depressing enough for you? The question was, how do I get out of bed in the morning? Sometimes it really is a problem, but kind of in reverse. I'll be lying in bed and I'll remember something I read the day before that was really upsetting, and I'll just go like this, and I'll say, "Oh God, how am I going to get back to sleep now?" You know, that's really the truth. I mean, it's yeah, no, it's not a fun subject to be studying. It really isn't.
Also this week, the New York Times had an editorial about the efforts of Cuba going into Liberia.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's any hope for competition between great powers
To send
stand
doctors?
out to each other in these humanitarian or neoliberal
Well,
efforts?
You know, he's referring to the fact that you'll tell me if I got the number right, but I think Cuba sent 400 doctors to Liberia. The U.S. sent several thousand troops, right? I mean, come on, right? And you'd think that the embarrassment of it being Cuba, right, that they would send 400 or 4,000 doctors, you know, but they just didn't acknowledge it at all, right? And I think that they've been pretty good at not acknowledging the fact that these humanitarian interventions of them are military, you know, and they're not humanitarian, and they're immiserating instead of humanitarianizing, you know. And I mean, and sometimes you've got to, you know, there's a whole literature on authentic humanitarian intervention, right? That is to say, you know, we have a world humanitarian regime now, right? We have this huge network of humanitarian organizations. Some of them are associated with the UN. Some of them are associated with national governments. The bulk of them are NGOs, non-government organizations that are nonprofits, right? You know, we hear the names of a lot of them: Doctors Without Borders, the Civil Liberties Union, Amnesty International, one of my favorites, right? They're all, you know, there's a huge network of them, and they get tons and tons of money, and a lot of the money comes from governments, right? And yet, they get stuff, they get resources for certain things and not other things. And I just read an article the other day that Ebola just doesn't generate the donations. You know, they can't get the millions they need. Doctors Without Borders, you know, I think some figure that said they're getting 35% of what they would want or something, you know. It's just not generating these donations. And then now a lot of the donations are from rich people, and who knows why they're not doing it. But a lot of the donations are from governments, who knows why they're not doing it, right? I mean, the U.S. government could just hand over some money to Doctors Without Borders, but probably the U.S. government thinks those French guys are subversives or something. I don't know, you know. But when you read about that whole nexus, that regime, you realize that that regime is as big as it is, and as well funded as it often is really directed only to certain places at certain times by the flow of donations. And they don't have the ability to go in and do something, you know, when they see something is needed. They don't have that capacity. And it's really a shame. You know, it's really terrible. And it's another reflection of the fact, going back to the United Nations, this should be a United Nations thing. We should have a United Nations thing where, you know, UNESCO or UNICEF or all of their agencies are amply funded so they can go and really do the work, you know. It ain't happening. It just ain't happening. Way up there.
Is there any difference between the older sort of model of this in Bosnia and in Kosovo and what we're seeing now, say, post 9/11 with the advent of the war on terror?
I think there is a difference between Kosovo. I mean, not that Kosovo worked out well. Let's be real, right? I mean, probably the intervention that the United States organized killed more people than any of the atrocities it was designed to stop, right? I mean, I haven't seen all the figures, but they're pretty horrible, right? But it didn't set in motion a cycle of immiseration and re-intervention. And so, I mean, you know, comparative atrocities, you know, I think in this case we can choose the earlier atrocity that as preferable to the later atrocity for that reason. You know, they went in, they did this thing, they stopped something and they destroyed a huge amount of stuff. They set in motion another set of bad things, and then it did end, you know, because they didn't try to transform the societies and then create that second round of immiseration that was going to, you know, really do it in. So that, yeah, that would be my answer to that. It's my...
Thank you, Professor Schwartz.
And thank you.